The road north out of Arvencrest was a punishment in February. I had ridden it twice before, once when I was 7, on the back of my father's horse, and once when I was crowned, in a procession with banners and drums and 40 wolves flanking my stirrups. This time I rode it alone, in a cloak I had borrowed from the garrison's second-hand chest, with a horse I had traded my signet ring to obtain, a brown gelding with one cloudy eye and absolutely no opinion of me. That was the point. My name is Aldrich. I am the Alpha King of Valdenmoor, Lord of 7 Pack territories, keeper of the Arvencrest fortress and the Moonwatch seal, and the most thoroughly lied to man in my own kingdom. Not by criminals, by my court. It had come to a head 3 weeks before at the autumn recognition ceremony, when I had watched 12 council members and their households perform devotion so practiced, so polished, so entirely hollow, that I had felt something go quiet inside my chest. Not my wolf had already been quiet for years, had been going slowly still the way ice forms over a pond, one layer at a time, until nothing beneath it moved. What went quiet was the last of my willingness to pretend that the warmth in that hall was real. I wanted to find one person whose goodness cost them something. One person who was kind not because a king was watching, but because kindness was the only language they spoke. My captain had called it reckless. My advisor had called it delusional. I had told them both I was going north to inspect the border garrisons, stripped myself of everything bearing a royal mark, put on the name of a discharged soldier Cale, a name common enough to vanish in a crowd, and ridden out before dawn. I reached the border village of Thornwall on the 3rd day, an hour before dark, with sleet beginning to fall and the gelding expressing its first firm opinion, which was that it would not be going another mile without shelter. Thornwall was small. 12 buildings, a mill that had lost half its wheel to a winter flood, a garrison post that existed mainly on paper, and 3 establishments that served travelers, 2 inns and a place that appeared to be an inn, but was in fact a sheep shed with a sign on it. I tried the first inn. The woman at the door looked at my cloak, looked at my horse, and told me the rooms were full. They were not full. I could see an empty table through the window. I tried the second. A man answered, sized me up in approximately 1 second, and told me his rate was 4 silver marks a night, which he said with the particular confidence of someone who knew I didn't have 4 silver marks a night. He was right. I had left Arvencrest with enough coin to last a week on a soldier's budget, because a soldier's budget was what Cale could plausibly carry. 4 silver marks was a nobleman's rate, charged to a man in a borrowed cloak on a one-eyed horse as a method of refusal that didn't require a door slammed in the face. I thanked him and walked the gelding back to the road. The sleet had become snow. There was a 3rd building at the far end of the village, narrower than the others, the sign so weathered I couldn't read it until I was close enough to touch it. A faded wolf carved in the wood, painted over so many times the detail was nearly gone. The door had a cracked lower panel that someone had repaired with a different timber, unstained, so the patch showed pale against the dark. I knocked. The woman who opened it was young, perhaps 25, perhaps 30, the kind of face that settled somewhere in that gap and didn't announce itself. She wore an apron over a plain work dress, her hair tied back simply, and she had the particular quality of stillness that I associated with people who were never surprised by much. She looked at me. She looked at the horse. She looked at the snow that had collected on my shoulders. She said, "How long have you been out in this?" "Since this morning," I said. "I'm looking for a room. I was told the village was full." She stepped back from the door. "It isn't full. Come in before the gelding gets any more opinions about you." I tied the horse under the eaves and followed her inside. The inn, if it qualified as one, and generously it did, held 6 tables, a fire large enough to matter, and the smell of something with onions cooking at the back. 2 old men were playing cards in the corner and didn't look up. A traveling merchant type was asleep against the wall with his hat over his face. That was the full population of the room. The woman, her name was Marin. She told me when I asked. The way someone gives information because it's practical, not because they're offering anything, set a bowl of soup in front of me before I had mentioned food. I didn't order that, I said. No, she said. You'll order it in a moment when you realize you're cold enough to eat it. I'm saving us both time. My wolf, which had been sleeping for years, turned over. It wasn't recognition. I didn't know what it was. I only knew that something shifted, some settled weight in my chest that had been there so long I had stopped noticing it. The way you stop noticing a stone in your boot after enough miles, and then you sit down, and you take off the boot, and you realize how long you've been walking wrong. I ate the soup. It was good. I asked the rate for the room. 1 copper for the night, she said. Same as anyone, includes breakfast if you're up before the bread's gone. I looked at her. 1 copper was less than a meal at the lowest tavern in Arvencrest. It was the rate of someone who had decided that the point of an inn was to let travelers sleep, not to extract maximum coin from people who had no other options. That can't be what you charge, I said. It's what I charge, she said, and went back to the kitchen. I stayed 3 days. I told myself it was the snow. The road north became impassable the morning after I arrived, a wall of white that the gelding and I would not be walking through before it cleared. That was true. It was also true that I was watching. On the first morning, I saw her give her own breakfast, the bread she had set aside for herself before the others came down, to an elder who lived 2 doors over and had come to the door asking if there were any scraps going. She did it without commentary. She did not make the woman feel like a charity case. She just said, I made too much, which was not true, and poured tea into a second cup. On the second afternoon, 2 traders argued over a debt in the corner of the room, voices rising, and Marin came out of the kitchen and sat down between them. She did not take sides. She did not raise her own voice. She asked each of them separately what they actually needed, not what they were arguing about, but what they needed, and by the time she was finished they had reached an agreement and were sharing a pot of ale. She went back to the kitchen. They didn't thank her. She didn't appear to need it. On the second night, the merchant's horse had taken sick in the stable, not the horse's illness, but a dog, a stray that had crept in out of the cold and was shivering so badly it couldn't stand. I woke up in the small hours of the morning. I sleep lightly, always have, the habit of a king who doesn't entirely trust his own fortress, and heard movement downstairs. I came halfway down the stairs and stopped. Marin was sitting on the floor of the common room, the dog's head in her lap, feeding it broth from a spoon. There was a lantern on the table beside her, turned low. She was talking to the dog in the way people talk when they don't expect to be overheard, quietly, steadily, not saying anything in particular, just filling the silence with a voice so the animal knew it wasn't alone. She had been there from the look of the cold hearth for at least 2 hours. My wolf went entirely, absolutely still. Not the stillness of sleep, the stillness of attention. The way a wolf freezes in a clearing when it has found something it wasn't looking for and doesn't yet know what to do about it. I went back upstairs and sat on the edge of the bed in the dark for a long time. On the 3rd day, my hand. There was a fence behind the inn, a wooden rail that marked the edge of the property, one of the posts loose enough to wobble. I had offered to fix it in exchange for the second night's rate, because I was a soldier and soldiers did that sort of thing, and because I needed something to do with my hands while I watched and my wolf did whatever it was doing with that new, unbearable stillness. I split the heel of my palm on a nail head when the post shifted, not serious, enough to bleed. Marin saw it when I came back in and told me to sit down. She brought a cloth and a jar of something that smelled of pine and dried herbs, and she cleaned the cut with a steadiness that told me she had done this many times, not medicinal precision but practical care, the kind that doesn't make the injured person feel like a burden. You don't have to do this, I said. You were fixing my fence, she said. I think I do. She was pressing the cloth to my palm when I felt it. Warmth, not from the cloth beneath it. Under my skin from the inside, moving up from the base of my hand with a slowness that was nothing like pain and nothing like cold and nothing like anything I could name. I looked at my wrist. The mark was faint. I had to look hard to see it, the way you have to look hard at stars when the moon is bright. A pattern, not quite a scar, more like something that had always been present in the skin and was only now becoming visible. Maren had gone still. I looked up at her. She was looking at her own wrist. The mark on her skin was clearer than mine. It had been there longer, I understood later, had been waking in stages for the 3 days I had been sitting in her common room, eating her soup, and watching her feed a sick dog at midnight without telling anyone. She looked at me with an expression I couldn't entirely read, not fear, not wonder, something more like a person arriving at an answer they had been trying to work out and finding it more complicated than expected. Cale, she said, and her voice was careful, what are you? Not what I said, I told her. She put the cloth down. She did not move away. She looked at the mark on her wrist, and at mine, and then back at my face with that same unhurried quality she had brought to the trading dispute and the dog and the elder at the door, the quality of someone who does not panic at the arrival of hard information. Tell me, she said. I opened my mouth. And that was when the horses arrived. There were 4 of them, riding hard up the snow-covered road from the south, my own scouts, in Arvencrest colors, which I recognized even through the small window's frost-edged glass. My captain's bay was in the lead. I knew that horse better than I knew most people. I stood up very quickly. Maren had seen the horses too. She had seen the colors. And she had seen, somewhere in the shift of my posture from a discharged soldier to something else entirely, that these men were looking for me, and that their arrival was the kind of arrival that preceded consequences. She moved before I could. She went to the door and opened it, and she stepped outside into the snow, and she positioned herself on the threshold of her own inn in the way a person positions themselves when they intend to be the first obstacle anyone has to get through. She had no idea who I was. She had a wrist with a mark on it, and 3 days of watching a quiet man fix her fence post, and she stood in the February snow between him and 4 armed riders, because it was the kind of thing she did when she thought it was right. My captain reined in 20 feet away. He looked at her. He looked at the man in the second-hand cloak standing just inside the doorway behind her. I stepped outside. I took off the hood. The silence that followed had a specific texture, the particular quality of 4 men who have been riding hard for 2 days to find their king, and have just found him standing behind an innkeeper's daughter in a border village during a snowstorm, with a mate mark visible on his wrist. My captain dismounted. He knelt in the snow. The other 3 followed. Maren had turned to look at me. She was doing the calculation, the deference, the colors, the kneel, and arriving at the answer in the particular way she arrived at things, which was without drama and with a great deal of precision. The king, she said, it wasn't a question. Yes, I said. She looked at her wrist. She looked at mine. She said, that explains some things. It does, I said. Maren. You were looking for something, she said. When you came here, that's what you were doing. It wasn't an accusation. She was just naming what she'd seen, the same way she named everything, plainly, without embellishment, because she had never found embellishment particularly useful. Yes, I said. I was looking for one person whose goodness was real. She considered this for a moment, the snow falling steadily around both of us. My captain still kneeling in the road with the patience of a man who had long since made peace with his king's methods. And she said, and I found her, I said, in the first bowl of soup. Something moved across her face, not sentiment, not performance, just a quiet shift, the way a fire settles when it has found its fuel and no longer needs to reach. "You should have just said who you were," she said. "You would have been different," I said. She thought about it honestly. "I don't think I would have," she said. I believed her. That was the thing. I had watched her for 3 days, and I believed her entirely. She would have given the elder her bread whether or not a king was watching. She would have sat with the dog in the dark whether or not anyone ever knew. She would have stood in the snow between a stranger and armed riders, because that was what a person did, in her understanding, when someone needed standing between. The mate mark on my wrist had known before I did. I sent my captain back to Arvincrest ahead of us with a message for the council. Marin's father, a wiry, gray-templed man who had been at the mill and who arrived home to find 4 horses, a king, and his daughter standing in the snow with matching marks on their wrists, handled the information with approximately the same unhurried precision as his daughter, asked 2 practical questions about the timeline, and then went inside to make tea for everyone. I liked him immediately. We stayed in Thornwall 2 more days while the road cleared. I did not go back to being Kale, but I found that being Aldrich in a place where no one owed me anything felt different than being Aldrich in Arvincrest. At Arvincrest, people adjusted themselves around me, the angle of their spine, the pitch of their voice, the words they chose. In Thornwall, they continued doing what they were doing and simply included me in it. Marin's father asked me to hold a timber while he braced it. The 2 old men asked if I played cards. I said I did. I lost 3 hands and won 2, and felt something in my chest that I hadn't felt in a long time, which was the simple, uncomplicated sensation of being an ordinary person in a room with other ordinary people. Marin worked. That was the thing about her. She was always working, not frantically but steadily, the way water moves. She cooked, she cleaned, she kept accounts in a ledger with a handwriting that was small and efficient and exact. She talked to me the same way she talked to everyone else, which was directly and without flattery, and she asked questions when she had them and didn't ask them when she didn't. On the second evening, sitting by the fire after the common room had emptied, she said, "I'll need to know what this is. The mark." "The mate bond," I said. "In our world, the pack world, it's the recognition of a fated mate. It means we were made for each other. The bond has its own certainty about it. It doesn't ask permission." She looked at her wrist. The mark had grown clearer over the days. It was fully visible now, a branching pattern that moved from wrist to the edge of her palm, as though something had taken root. "And if I wanted to say no," she said. "You could," I said. "It would grieve me. It would probably grieve the bond for a long time, but you could." She nodded slowly. "I'm asking because I want to understand the shape of the thing before I decide, not because I'm planning to." I looked at her. "The soup," I said. "You gave me soup before I'd said a word." "You were cold," she said. "That's not remarkable." "It was remarkable," I said. "You'd be surprised how rare it is." She thought about this with the same seriousness she gave everything. "That's a sad piece of information about a king's life," she said. "Yes," I said, "it is." She looked at the fire for a moment. Then she said, "I'll come to Arvincrest. I'd like to see it before I decide. I think that's fair." "It's more than fair," I said. "I'm also keeping the inn," she said. "My father is here. I'm not vanishing into a fortress and pretending I grew up behind stone walls." "I wouldn't ask you to," I said. "Good," she said, with the settled quality of someone who had just reached a working agreement. "Then let's see how it goes." The road to Arvincrest took 3 days. On the first day, Marin rode beside me and said nothing much. She looked at the country, the frozen fields, the tree lines, the villages tucked into the river folds, with the attention of someone storing information. On the second day, she asked about the pack territories, what each one managed, what the disputes between them tended to be about, how I settled them. I found myself answering at length. which I rarely did, because she asked the next question precisely and didn't fill silence with flattery when I paused. On the third day, she said, "Who told you the village was full, the first in?" "The woman at the door," I said. "Her name is Berta," Marin said. "She knew the rooms weren't full. She says that to travelers who look like they might not be able to pay." "I know," I said. "It doesn't bother you." "It bothered me more when the second innkeeper told me the rate was 4 silver marks," I said. "That was more creative." She almost smiled. It was the first time I had seen anything close to it. It rearranged her face in a way I found I would be thinking about for a long time. 4 silver marks, she said. "For a room with a broken shutter," I said. "He does that," she said. "He doesn't like to say no directly. He'd rather price you out." "It's an efficient system," I said. "It's a cowardly system," she said. "If you don't want to let someone in, you should have the manners to say so." She said it without anger, just as a point of fact, and I thought again about the quality she had, the directness that was not harshness but its opposite, because harshness closes things down and her directness always seemed to open them. We arrived at Arvencrest on a clear afternoon, the fortress rising against a sky so pale it was nearly white, the banners moving slowly in the February wind. My captain had prepared the council. The council chamber held 23 people when we entered, 12 council members, their senior advisors, and a handful of the pack's elder representatives, who had been called in from the territories at the news that the king had returned from his journey in the company of a woman bearing the mate mark. I had been in this room hundreds of times. I knew its politics the way I knew the stones in its walls, who sat near whom, who never looked directly at the person speaking, who smiled most broadly when the news was worst. 23 people who had spent months, in some cases years, performing loyalty for my benefit. I introduced Marin. I will say this for my council. They were skilled people, and skilled people can adjust their expression very quickly. But there was a half-second before the adjustment, a half-second in which I saw it, the inventory, the assessment, the border village origin, the innkeeper's daughter, the plain traveling dress, the unhurried posture that was not deferential and not aggressive but simply present. The half-second in which several of them decided she was less than they expected, and in which not one of them thought she could see them doing it. She could see them doing it. I knew this because I watched her face during that half-second, and nothing in it changed except for a quiet attention that settled in her eyes. The same attention she had given the trading dispute, the same she had given the dog, the same she turned on everything she was assessing honestly. She was already understanding them. They hadn't started understanding her. Council Elder Brevin, the eldest and most practiced at surface warmth, spoke first, said the right welcoming things in the right welcoming tone, and meant approximately none of it. Marin thanked him. She said, "I understand this is unexpected. I'd like to hear what concerns you directly when you're ready to say them." Brevin blinked. "I'm not easily managed by politeness," she said, not unkindly. "If you'd like to tell me what you're actually thinking, I prefer that. We'll get further." The room was very quiet. I did not look at my captain, because I would have found it difficult to maintain my composure. What followed was, by the standards of council chambers, unprecedented. 2 of the 12 said what they actually thought, which was that a Luna chosen from the border territories, rather than the pack's noble families, would create complications in the alliance structures. Marin listened to both of them without interrupting. Then she asked 3 questions, each one cutting directly to the practical center of the concern, that demonstrated she had understood the alliance structure more clearly in 3 minutes of listening than several council members had demonstrated in 3 years of theorizing about it. By the time she finished, Elder Brevin was quiet in a different way than before. The mate mark on her wrist was fully visible. Mine matched it. The bond did not need ceremony or validation, but the ceremony, I understood now, served a purpose. It made visible what was real in front of the people who needed to see it. I stood up. I said, I rode north in February in a second-hand cloak on a horse with one good eye to find one person whose goodness was real. I sat in her common room for 3 days. She gave soup to a man who hadn't asked for it and couldn't pay. She fed a sick stray dog in the dark for 2 hours without telling anyone. She stood in the snow between a stranger and armed riders because it was the right thing, and it didn't occur to her to calculate the cost first. The mate bond recognized her before I could name what I was seeing. I looked at the council. She is my fated mate. She will be your Luna. Those of you who have concerns, she has already told you she prefers them said plainly, and I expect you to do her that courtesy. The room was very still. Elder Brevin stood. He was old enough to have served my father, which meant he was old enough to have seen more political theater than almost anyone in Valdenmoor, and old enough to know the difference between theater and the real thing. He bowed. The others followed, not the practiced, angled bow of a performance, but the full bow of people who had just understood that the ground had shifted, and the best thing to do was acknowledge it. Marin did not smile at this. She accepted it with the same quiet steadiness she brought to everything, not as triumph, not as vindication, but as information about where things stood. She looked at me. One good eye, she said quietly, while the council was rising. He gets me where I'm going, I said. Every time. Close enough, I said. This time she did smile, and the council member nearest us had the particular experience of watching their king's composure depart briefly and completely, which I suspect they found informative about the shape of what was coming. We were married in April in Thornwall, because Marin had said the fortress could have the formal ceremony, and the capital could have the banners and the drums and the 40 wolves, but the vows were hers to give, and she was giving them at home. Her father stood in the snow of the courtyard. The snow was late that year, still falling in the first week of April, which Marin said was Thornwall's ordinary lunacy. And he held the Moonwatch seal, which I had returned to the fortress 7 weeks before, and then deliberately brought back, because the seal recognizes the bloodline of the Alpha King's true mate, and I wanted her father to hold it when it woke. It woke in his hands the moment she spoke the vow. A quiet warmth, visible at the seal's center, not spectacular, not blazing, but steady and clear and unmistakable. Her father looked at it for a long moment. Then he looked at me. Soup, he said. From the beginning, I said. He handed me the seal and looked at his daughter and didn't say anything, because the kind of people who raise daughters like Marin are usually the kind of people who don't need to. My council learned, over the following months, what I had learned in 3 days. Not that she was kind, they had seen that. Not that she was intelligent, they had discovered that in the first council session at some cost to their assumptions. What they learned was that she was the same person in every room. In the throne room and the market square and the council chamber and the garrison hall in the north, where the pack elder had been certain that a border village Luna would condescend to the lower territories, she was the same. She listened. She asked the questions that went to the center. She said what she thought directly, without unkindness. She did not perform warmth and she did not perform power. She simply engaged with whatever was in front of her honestly, and it turned out that this was, in the long accounting, the most disarming quality a Luna could have. Elder Brevin became her most effective advocate in the council, which I suspect surprised him almost as much as it surprised the others. The second innkeeper in Thornwall, the one who had told me his rate was 4 silver marks and watched me leave in the snow, was not invited to the wedding. I mention this not because it was a notable act of vengeance, because it wasn't, but because Marin had not thought to invite him and had not noticed the omission. And when I pointed it out, she said simply, "Oh, I didn't think of it," and went back to her account ledger. Which was, I thought, precisely right. There are people in the world who engineer their vindications, who arrange the moment and choose the witnesses and make certain the right people are watching when the reversal lands. And then there are people who are too busy being exactly who they are to give the reversal much thought. Marin was the second kind. I keep the second-hand cloak. It hangs in our chamber. She asked me not to throw it away, which I found I had no intention of doing. It is the cloak I was wearing when she opened the door and looked at me and looked at my horse and looked at the snow on my shoulders and asked how long I'd been out in it, which turned out to be the question I had been waiting to be asked my entire life, although I hadn't known I was waiting. Some mornings she sees me looking at it and she says nothing, because we have reached the particular ease of people who have learned each other's silences. But sometimes she says, "The soup." And I say, "From the beginning." And she goes back to whatever she's doing, and the mark on my wrist is warm, and outside the window of Arvencrest the wolves are moving through the snowlight, and this kingdom, which I have ruled for 11 years through performance and ceremony, and the polished distance of a man who had forgotten what real warmth felt like, is, at last, entirely itself.